This is part two of the Introduction to Anthropology lecture. The last film you looked at was The Axe Fight, which was recorded by Napoleon Chagnon. What you need to take away from that video is that once you go into the field, you should have a good understanding of the culture that you intend to study. Chagnon spent 12 years with the Yanomamo of Amazonia. In the first couple of years, he did activities that normally anthropologists do, but he failed to do enough prior background research to understand some of the taboos that are part of Yanomamo culture. So when you first go into a society to study them, you probably want to do things that are not too intrusive. So one of the things you can do is collect genealogy. So ask people how they perceive of other individuals within their extended family. In Yanomamo culture, it is taboo to speak the name of a deceased relative. Chagnon didn't know this. So when he conducted his genealogies, the Yanomamo would give him fictive relationships. So instead of their father, he would make up a name for some individual, and that's what they would give him as their father or their mother or their brother, sister, if they were deceased. So Chagnon spent a year developing this kinship network that included all the relatives of the individuals in the village that he was studying. And only when he went to a second neighboring village, and in Yanomamo society, neighboring villages are usually enemies, they gave him the correct genealogy because it's okay to speak the name of a deceased relative if it's not a relative of yours. So Chagnon wasted a whole year in Yanomamo society. The axe fight itself is alleged to be scripted by Chagnon. But if you listen to the anthropologists speaking as this is going on, you understand that they maintained their distance from the activity that was going on. So we all are expected to engage in participant observation at some time or other. And participant observation would mean, in that particular case, pick up an axe and get involved in the fight. That's not a good thing to do. So it just gives you a taste of how an anthropologist should observe at a distance. Also, that's basically the functional equivalent, that space that the Yanomamo are in, of your living room. So it demonstrates to you how different living with the Yanomamo is than living with your family. I'm sure your family doesn't get engaged in axe fights every day. In Yanomamo society, that's typical kinds of behavior. Okay, let's move on a little bit and talk about some of my ethnographic fieldwork. I'm an archaeologist by trade. That's the kind of research I do. But I combine cultural anthropology with archaeology and really conduct ethnographic fieldwork with my workers and community members where I'm studying the archaeology. So field work is the firsthand exploration of a society and culture. So it's actually getting your passport, going to a strange land, and exploring a foreign society and its culture. It develops a holistic perspective about the culture. So I think, as I stated before, holism is basically if we study foods that are object of study consumes, we also study the implements they use to consume it, how it's cooked, how it's grown, if there's any symbolic foods in the culture. So it's a holistic approach. We even get into nutritional value of certain foods. And basically, our field work reveals the difference between what people say they do and what they are really doing. So we use the emic and the etic perspective to understand what they're doing. Even in our society, there are things we do that we don't really understand the total function of that to support an adaptive culture. So this gives us the opportunity to understand it. Pictured here is Don Foberto Fuentes, and he's a resident of Sacalum, Yucatan, Mexico. The photo was taken in 1996 while I was doing archaeological work throughout the Yucatan Peninsula, but also doing some ethnographic work. The story behind this is that there is a publication that was written right after the conquest of Yucatan, and that would have been about 1546 through 1550. And it describes the travels of a group of people known as the Itza, from their arrival on the western shore of the peninsula until they arrived at the site of Chichen Itza, which is their home place, and established a hegemonic government which ruled basically the entire peninsula for a couple hundred years at least. Within the publication, which is tracks their travels, and it's known as the Chronicles of Yucatan. There's a description of the Itza travels, and they traveled all over the place, hundreds of place names, and while during their travels, they got what was called the bleeding disease. Well, if you've ever heard about traveling in Mexico, you don't drink the water. So what they really contracted was hemorrhagic dysentery from drinking the water that they weren't used to. And the chronicle goes on to say that these people stopped at a village called Sacalum, and that is Sacalum is the Spanish corruption of Sacalum, which is a Maya word for white clay. The residents of Sacalum gave the Itza some medicine, and it cured the bleeding disease, and they were able to go on and travel the rest of the peninsula and establish their site, their home site at Chichen Itza in the Yucatan Peninsula. I was interested in that historical chronicle and traveled to Sacalum to study the distribution of clay for consumption, which is known as geophagy. Geophagy is practiced all over the world by indigenous people. It's basically the consumption of clay, we call it dirt even, the consumption of clay for medicinal reasons. The residents of Sacalum consume clay today, and it is said to cure everything from common cold, from morning sickness to tuberculosis and some forms of cancer. So this is all about traditional medicinal practices and how they function through the mind to cure diseases without the use of traditional Western medication and pharmaceuticals. So that's what I was interested in. Additionally, in most places throughout Mesoamerica, clay is consumed, but it's consumed in the context of a religious behavior. So when the Catholic Church and those missionaries came to Latin America and Mesoamerica and Mexico, they were instrumental in the conquest. They noticed that all the indigenous folks were eating clay on a regular basis for medicinal reasons. So they took over the distribution of this clay that these people were consuming and integrated it into their religious belief system by making small tablets out of the clay and stamping those with the Blessed Virgin Mary, Christ crucified, Saint Joseph, and all sorts of religious iconography. So then integrated it into the religious belief system. So today, in many areas, the church is involved in the distribution of clay for consumption, and it has a religious overtone. Well, I suspected that was not the case in Sakhalin, Yucatan, and underwent this study. So, Don Filberto Fuentes is a curandero, a healer. When I first got there, and spoke to him. He also owns a tienda, a small store. He said, "No, I'm not involved in the distribution or sales of clay for consumption at all." That's typical of indigenous folks or natives when a foreigner first comes in and starts to ask a lot of questions. As a matter of fact, in Mexico, the indigenous folks are skeptical of the motives of anthropologists because they equate anybody that comes in that's a foreigner or from a foreign place as somebody representing the government, the man. And they have an ulterior motive, which usually, typically, in their mind, has to do with taking their property. So, funny story, while I was inside the tienda, and Don Filberto was out changing clothes because he had just come in from making his milpa, his cornfield. His granddaughter was tending the store. I noticed that she was pregnant, quite pregnant, very close to birth. And I asked her if she took anything for morning sickness. She said, "Of course, I take something every day for morning sickness." And I said, "What do you take?" And she says, "I eat clay from the cenote." Cenote is a sinkhole or a cave under the ground. And I said, "Where do you buy it?" She says, "Well, we sell it right here," and pulled out a big chunk of it from under the counter. Well, Don Filberto was had. And that chunk that he's holding in this photograph is the chunk of clay. That coke that's on the step next to Don Filberto was what I used to chase the clay, because once I discovered that that's what was going on, they were selling clay in a participant way, I had to consume some of it. It's not very tasty. It dries your mouth up instantly and forms to a sticky mass in your mouth. So I use the coke to chase it. This is the cenote at Sakhalin, Yucatan, Mexico, in the upper left. That's the chamber where they send the children down there with flashlights in the olden days with candles, and they pick it off of the wall. That's a sticky mess down there. I had to go in there and actually wade through or slide through, if you'll see my pointer, this narrow chamber where barely from front to back I could slide through. These are the steps that go down into the cenote. It's about 60 meters below ground level. Manuriges Sobrianas is the comisario of the village. When you're doing ethnographic field work, you must get permission of the community members. So he's the first person I talked to. Doña Matilde Dominguez, up here in the upper right, is actually the woman who trained Don Filberto, lower right-hand corner. So she is a curandera, and she still dispenses clay today as well. She's in her late 80s at the time of this ethnographic project, and Filberto was in his 70s. So she did all the training of Don Filberto. She was a really nice woman. Once again, had to go change, and she put on her classic huipil, and she's standing out in the back of her house. And this is this raised area is a solare, or a plant garden or herb garden that she raises. So those are the all the protagonists that I dealt with there, along with some other individuals. So how do you do feel? The first thing, as we learned about Napoleon Chagnon and the Yanomamo, is consult prior research for various reasons. Number one, you want to understand a little bit of the language, because everything about culture is filtered through the language. You want to understand it. Also, it's a good idea if you're going in to study a society who still engages in cannibalism, eats the bones of their dead ancestors by grinding them up and putting them in a plantain soup like the Yanomamo. You want to understand those things that are typical and normal in those societies. So conduct prior research, extensive. If you're doing research for a thesis or a dissertation, you should have consulted everything ever written about those societies, including ethnographic works from colonial periods. Easy, non-intrusive thing to do is record life histories or genealogies. So you want to record genealogies, understand who's related to who, what's the structure of the community, all of that. You can do photography and filming, but ethically, you must tell anyone who you are recording their voice or taking photographs that that's what you're doing. In the case of the Maya, they do not like to have you taking the photographs simply because of the soul stealing component of that. So you have to get permission to do that. In fact, some modern ethnographic works are simply videos and audios of interviews. You want to observe at a distance first. We really want to get to participant observation, but the first thing you should do is observe at a distance and understand everything that's going on before you jump in the water. If you want to walk the hot coals barefooted, watch somebody do it for a while before you try it. If you want to understand what's happening physically and mentally during a indigenous ceremony where they're going on a vision quest using hallucinogenic drugs, you want to observe at a distance first before participating. And naturally, you don't have to do that because of the philosophy of moral relativity. If that's not the thing you want to do, you don't have to do it. But observe at a distance first. See what's going on. And also that gives you the etic perspective, which would let you know what actually is going on in that ceremony. What's it doing for those folks that they might not even conceptualize. And then participant observation is the final thing you want to do. You want to get the emic perspective. What's going on inside the mind of those folks. But keep in mind you will never get the full emic because you haven't been socialized in that society. So here I am in the lower left drinking balche, which is a fermented liquid that the Maya use in ceremonies. This is a Chachak rain ceremony, only been visited by probably no more than 10 Western individuals ever, and I was given the opportunity to spend 2 nights and 3 days with a bunch of men out in the rainforest conducting this ceremony to bring rain to the milpas. So in the photo, in the center of the small photo, that's a mock-up of a milpa, a cornfield, with the mantle over the earth above it, and at the ending of this ceremony, the rains come. The upper right-hand corner is traditional Maya women who are a bit urbanized, but all Maya households, this is a modern household, this is sort of urbanized, have an altar and they say their prayers every day. And these are pescadores, fishing people off the coast of northern Yucatan in the lower right-hand corner. Okay, so we're finished up with cultural anthropology. That's the first subdiscipline of the 4 in the study of anthropology. And we're moving on to the next, which is linguistic anthropology. Linguistic anthropology has a few goals. Number one is understanding the workings of human mind as expressed in language. And number two, and most importantly, is to elucidate the relationship of language to culture. Up until the 1950s and 60s, the only interest that anthropologists had in language was interest in being able to understand other languages, most especially the language of the culture that you were going to study. Without that understanding, you couldn't get anywhere near the true meaning. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a revolution, if you will, in the natural sciences, and my favorite saying is, as revolutions go in the natural sciences, so they go in the social sciences. So a lot of the scientific methods that were initiated in the 1950s and 60s in the natural sciences kind of uh, drifted into the social sciences as well. So we're now understanding that language and culture are closely related, and in fact, there are some theories that deal with that particular relationship. So, the first thing we want to do is study language variation, and we study that through linguistic development. So, how does language vary, and how does it develop in the cultures that it's embedded in? The relationship between language and culture, very important, and then how languages are learned. There are two specializations. Descriptive linguistics. Descriptive linguistics is the study of the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of language itself, how in fact humans um, form all the meaningful utterances that we make in our lives. It's very interesting to note that with the ability to make between 35 and 50 sounds with our speaking apparatus, we are able to create an infinite number of meaningful utterances. So, descriptive linguists look at all those things. They look at phones, which are the sounds we make, phonemes, which are words formed from blending of sounds. They look for morphemes, which are the words that are made up from blending sounds together, and the rules that govern combinations of morphemes into meaningful sentences. So that is the grammar of the language, and they also look at semantics. I find descriptive linguistics sort of boring personally. There are a couple elements of it that I'm interested in. One is historical linguistics. Historical linguists look at the relationship between different languages in a family, and they've come up with sort of a statistic that we can use to determine how many years it has been since two closely related languages separated. So, migration. And in archaeology, migration is quite important in the study of long disappeared civilizations. So basically, they use a procedure known as glottochronology, where they look at the core vocabulary of a language. What is the core vocabulary? The core vocabulary of a language is those 200 to 300 words that are most resistant to change and exist for elements that exist in all societies. So, the word for sky. Why would you want to change the word for sky? Why should it change? The word for sun. Why should it change? The word for blood. Why should it change? So, those are most resistant to change, and all languages do change. So, what we do is we compare cognates. Cognates are those words for sky, sun, moon, water, those things. And we look for changes in the phonemes that make up those words. The rule is that for every 1,000 years of separation between two closely related languages, the core vocabulary will change 14%. So, if we're looking at two closely related languages and we find that there's a 28% roughly difference in the core vocabulary, those two families have been separated for 2,000 years. So it's 14% per 1,000 years of separation. That's interesting to me. The other interesting portion of descriptive linguistics is called environmental descriptors. Environmental descriptors are words that describe the environment, mountains, waterfalls, snow, rain, those kind of things. And if a language system, spoken language, exists in, let's say, the South Pacific, and there are no mountains and no snow in the South Pacific, if there is a word in the spoken language of those folks who inhabit those islands for snow, that means at one point in the distant past, they lived in an environment where snow existed. If there are no mountains, that means that at one point in the distant past, and they have a word for mountains, that they lived in a mountainous area. So that gives us an idea of, number one, if we look at glottochronology, the time of separation, how long ago those two groups separated. Migration is the way they separate. And number two, the environment of their homeland. Sociolinguistics is the second specialization, and it basically looks at the context of speech events. So every time two interlocutors speak together, it looks at the context of the event. So if I was speaking to you in a room, it would look at the people in the room, their backgrounds, the color of the walls, the carpet on the floor, the tile on the floor, the equipment in the room, the kinds of words I'm using to indicate that I am the instructor and you are the pupil. So they describe these social events where communication takes place. Quite interesting. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is the major hypothesis that we deal with as anthropological linguists. Edward Sapir was a classically trained Boasian anthropologist and linguist. He was a linguistic specialist from Canada. Benjamin Whorf was an insurance adjuster around the same time Sapir was doing work in linguistics. They formulated a hypothesis with two versions, a strong version and a weak version. The strong version basically states that language affects and constructs, it's a very strong word, constructs human reality. So our language constructs human reality. The weaker version is language has some impact on the way we think about the world. Very weak version of it. Anthropologists are polarized on their support of this hypothesis. Actually, right at the moment, the evidence is supporting, I'm talking about scientific evidence here, is supporting the stronger version. Evidence that parts of the brain are formulating words when you see those words, and that impulse is in the soft pilot and ready to be spoken. So, one question I like to ask students that sort of indicates in favor of the stronger version is, It's actually not a question, it's a statement, and then students are able to respond. Is there anything in your reality that you cannot express through words, through the spoken language? And you'll find that after some thought on that, there isn't. There's a word for everything that humans can conceive of. So that argues for the strong hypothesis. We have the ability right now to track activity in the human brain as it relates to language. So we can record activity in certain portions of the brain. An experiment was done not too terribly long ago where an individual was put in a CT scan or MRI, and brain activity was monitored through the MRI. Different photos were shown to that individual, and that individual, he or she, was asked to think about what they're looking at. So, a hammer, a house, those kind of things. We found that when the individual thought about a house, certain areas of the brain lit up, became active. When they thought about a hammer, different areas of the brain would light up. So, a couple things. Number one, the concept of a house involves more than one area of the brain. So when you're thinking about house, you're not only thinking about the structure itself, you're probably thinking about the color, what goes on inside the house, how many rooms there are, your thoughts about that house. When you think about a hammer, you think about its shape, its weight, its color, how it's used. So all of those areas in the brain and all of those elements that make up the concept of a hammer go together to define it. And as you think it, it already is transmitted to the soft palate. You may not articulate it, but at least you're thinking about it. So that's evidence in support of a stronger version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So how do you think about your world? It goes into questions about what is wrong and what is right. What's natural for humans, what's not natural for humans. And you must think in an ethnocentric way at that point that what we might think is natural for human beings in our society might not be what that other society's individuals believe is natural for human beings as far as being. So that's Sapir-Whorf, and we'll get into this in a little more detail when we actually do a lecture on linguistic anthropology. The School of American Historical Particularism was founded by Franz Boas, who is the father of American anthropology. Franz Boas was an academically trained German geographer who founded the American School of Anthropology. American historical particularism basically states that a culture is the product of its historical context as well as geographic context. So no two cultures could be the same. And Franz Boas and the American historical particularism movement believed that in the instance of the United States, as we eradicated as a society the Native Americans and we lost speakers of those languages, we were losing cultures. We were losing the ability to say anything, make statements about those cultures. Alfred Kroeber, who was at the University of California, Berkeley, was a Boasian student. He worked with Edward Sapir, with Ishi, who was the last Yahi. There's a video that I will post where you can look at that. Ishi was a Native American. His tribe was reduced to nothing but one individual, himself, and for about a year, Grover and Edward Sapir tried to recover the lost culture of the Yahi through Ishi. And it's an unfortunate story, and I'll just let you look at the video and make your own judgment on how harsh our culture's past was. Have a look at this video.
Alongside standard American English, Black English, for example, has developed its own rich pattern of language and code.
A toast is a narrative or an epic poem. A lot of them are very...
Claudia Kernan, an anthropologist, studies the situational use of language, sociolinguistics, among Black Americans.
You know, the term Black English is the very recent vintage. When's the first time you ever heard that term, Naida?
Well, originally I heard the term Negro dialect growing up, and then it changed to Black dialect during the 60s. And really until I got into the university, I hadn't heard the term Black English.
What are the most interesting things that you've learned about the dialect?
I've learned about how the culture of Black people breeded the language, would breed a type of different way of communicating. In my own observation, I've learned that I think Black people who speak Black English do so because it is a more figurative, a more feeling, a more accurate kind of a language. For example, if it's cold, in standard English, it's very cold out here, and this chill is about to get to me. In Black English, man, this hawk is biting out here, I'm getting out of here, this chill is going to cut me down. It really tells how you really feel about things.
You know, the term rapping, you've all heard that term, is a piece of the metal language of Black American verbal culture. And as it was originally used, it described a very fluent and lively way of talking, particularly male talk. And rapping is now being used in a very, very special kind of sense. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, rapping started in prison where the inmates with a lot of time on their hand would make up these verses to the existing music on the radio. So now these former inmates have become really popular in the pop music scene and introduced the rap record. So I'm going to give you a little example of a rap record. Okay, so I want a little beat, you know, where everybody's like this. Okay. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. My son said, Daddy, I don't want to go to school because the teacher's a jerk. She must think I'm a fool. And all the kids smoke reefer. I think it'd be cheaper if I just got a job and became a street sweeper. Wear a shirt and tie, shuffle my feet, dance to the beat, and run with the freaks. Because it's all about money, ain't a damn thing funny. You gotta have a car in this land of milk and honey. Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
You grow up in an all-Black community, as I did. You don't really feel very different. You don't think about things like Black English, Black culture. I mean, it's the way what you learn is what everybody else does. And you behave like other people in the community behave. Anybody ever? Do you recall, for example, the first time you realized that you spoke differently than other people?
This is merely the situation where I came to UCLA coming from basically an all-Black environment, all-Black high schools, and to that fact, predominantly Black educators. I saw myself changing actually at my first year of college. The nasal quality of my speech changing. When I stopped using double negatives.
So I had just the opposite experience from you, where you feel the pressure to speak more standard. I kind of feel this pressure to speak more in Black English because like my upbringing was like all in like a strictly standard English white school environment. So when I got to area where there were more Blacks, and when I opened my mouth, the Blacks looked at me like, where's this guy come from? And even the whites were looking like, well, man, are you sure you want to sound like that? I mean, you sound like a little bit too white for the way you look, So now, as I get older, I kind of am trying to modify my speech so that I sound more black so that, you know, I can communicate better with, you know, blacks and consequently with whites.
What we are confronting basically are different grammatical rules. Our dialect is the sort of output of a somewhat different system of rules than standard English. But as you live in this society, you receive many, many subtle messages, sometimes not so subtle, that things that emanate out of black culture are to be valued less. And in some ways, it's been this sort of revolution in black consciousness that has made people like us really begin to focus on our culture as something worthy of study, just like any other culture, and focus on our heritage as a rich heritage, as an important component of the human experience, something that we should try to conserve and something that we should try to understand.